Ever since I was a child, I have felt a profound sense of wonder that anything exists at all, and that the experience of I is part of that reality, if not essential to it in some way. This breathtaking mystery of being has secretly pervaded my inner life with a kind of awe-inspired peace, but at the same time, a desperate yearning. Presence and stillness became gateways to something sacred, something that my mind could not grasp, but which my heart was called to answer. I have longed to devote myself to manifesting this passion in my life ever since, to sing its song to any that would hear it. Yet despite the significance that this deeply felt calling has for me, it has gone painfully unanswered my whole adult life. The fast-paced, productivity-obsessed demands of the human world have always felt dizzying, trivial, and suffocating. But I have nonetheless languished under the pressure to conform to those earthly expectations wrought by family, friends, and society. Many of us feel this way, but I have struggled with this to such a degree that even meeting the basic demands of the world has been a persistent challenge. That inadequacy has filled me with guilt, shame, and worthlessness. I have allowed that self-contempt to consume me and prevent me from expressing my enduring truth and secret passion. Until now. My name is Nicholas, or so I've been told, and about a year ago, my life completely changed when I made a terrifying leap of faith to follow my heart. I leapt into the unknown to answer that inscrutable calling within that had been silenced for too long, to be true to myself and actualize who I have always been deep down. It required escaping a life that was slowly killing me, but which I could not confess even to myself. I had been in a relationship for almost 15 years, complete with the happily ever after fairy tale. There was what felt like a lifetime of picturesque memories. We had escaped the city and nestled ourselves in the countryside. We were about to build a new house and start a family. I had a job on our idyllic pastures. My beloved cat accompanied me. I had planted hundreds of diverse trees and cared for them for years. I had built structures, fences, devices, a garden and orchard. My hobbies were tied to that life, my future vision, my whole financial security. It was the picture-perfect image of a privileged and fortunate yet modest life. But deep down, as so many of these cautionary tales go, I was miserable. While my outer world might have looked like sunshine, my inner world was a tempest brewing. Not a day went by that I didn't privately take a step back from my circumstance and think, this is not me. But what was making me so unhappy? Where were those feelings of inauthenticity coming from? The intricacies of this particular ego's story took a lot of hindsight to understand. Sparing the ugly details, I was stranded in a codependent relationship on the underside of a dysfunctional power imbalance. Worse, the unhealthy dynamic I had with my partner was exacerbated by enmeshment trauma and an anxious attachment style I inherited from my emotionally abusive mother. In short, all of that noise meant that subconsciously I believed that sacrificing my authentic needs was crucial to my emotional safety. It also meant that I always felt like I was personally responsible for my partner's feelings and so subjugated myself to them. Lastly, and perhaps the ultimate cause of the disaster that was to come, it meant I had little capacity for self-direction, and thus a loss of identity and ability to self-actualize. The real problem was the relationship I had with myself. I believed that any issue I had with my partner or lifestyle was my fault. After all, I was mentally and physically ill, struggling with chronic inflammation, obsessive-compulsive disorder, depression, and severe anxiety. I had been unemployed before moving to the countryside because of those afflictions. I was an invalid in my own mind, a child incapable of facing the adult world, an artifact of anxious attachment. I was the broken one, so of course it was my fault. When we moved to the countryside, my partner laid out a blueprint for our financial future, which was to enable our mutual dream of self-sufficiency. That blueprint came in the form of her continuing to stay in the city for work for half of the week, while I was to stay alone on our land as a cattle and sheep farmer. I did not want to be a farmer. I held deep ethical concerns about the industry, having been a vegetarian for over a decade prior. But who was I to put up any resistance to my partner's lucrative plan for a future we both wanted? I felt like I had no right to object to what was expected of me. I asked to farm carrots or corn instead, but my partner believed there was too much risk, so I went along with her sensible plan, telling myself in that typical toxic way to man up. Farming was a spirit-breaking and soul-crushing reality for a sensitive type like me, especially since I was alone for most of it, having to learn as I went with little instruction, exposed to the gruesome horrors of animal suffering and the stress of constant worry for their well-being and the frustration at their insatiable demand. Despite cautiously raising my qualms about farming through infrequent breakdowns into tears or outbursts of impotence, I was always defeated by the rationalizations of my partner. I trusted that she knew best, and I felt dutiful to make her happy by pulling myself up by the bootstraps, so to speak. And I did so for 7 years, day in, day out, rain or shine, literally up to my elbows in mud, crud, and blood, through all the fluctuating pain of my autoimmune disease and mental illness. Through my self-imposed isolation, in a vocation I did not choose for myself, alongside a contrived relationship whose foundation was built on a future that was forever fixed to the horizon, I felt truly alone. I was no longer in love, and I didn't know it. How could I remain in love when authenticity and emotional safety are requirements for intimacy? It felt like there was no room in the relationship for a second person. Ignoring my misery and living someone else's life was slowly eroding my soul. But I couldn't be fully honest with myself that I was miserable. I clung to mistaken beliefs that there was no alternative path in life for me, nor one that I deserved. No way I could live without the stability my arrangement afforded me, or that what I was looking for in life was even valid. I was a bird trapped in a gilded cage. In the back of my mind, the implications of breaking free were catastrophic. The uncertainties were too overwhelming to entertain such a reality. I frequently imagined a grim future of homelessness due to my trouble assimilating into society. I stood to lose everything. Or maybe just what I was taught to believe is everything. The questions of who I was and what I wanted from life were calling from the void of uncertainty ahead of me. And as I wavered at that edge, I looked back at the barren and desolate landscape from which I had tumbled, in which no part of me could continue to grow, and I knew that I had to let the winds of change whisk me off that edge. I had to trust that I would drift to more fertile ground that would nourish my roots. I had reached a breaking point where I had to do or die. I had been despairing at the edge of that precipice for too long. Though to save my life, I had to nonetheless slay a part of myself. I had to let go of the guilt that what I needed in life was selfish. I had to reject the judgments and expectations of others, dictating what I did with what was most important to me. Not doing so had been a recipe for resentment, unfulfillment, repression, and depression to the brink. Inevitability caught up to us. Our long relationship ended catastrophically and quite painfully, despite all attempts at a mature approach. I imploded in a way that ravaged both of us through a radical and confusing identity crisis. It all came out at once through unbridled overcorrection. Shards of repression pierced through the husk I had become, revealing the thinness and brittleness of its weathered form. A decade and a half of withheld resentment burst forth, exploding from the back pressure of unresolved childhood trauma. There was no turning back. The damage of all those years had been done. I was done. As to the remnants of love for my partner, as deeply in love as we had once been, I could not summon anything more than affectionate regard, and that spelt our sad end. The guilt of ending the relationship was the most severe I had ever felt, but finally standing up to my inner demon that comprised that guilt was deeply healing for me. Now, almost a year later, even though I'm struggling to make ends meet with the demands of living, and my future and security are wholly uncertain from having been left with virtually nothing, I am the happiest I've ever been, despite losing what some would say was everything. How can that be? Because I am now what I never was, but always needed to be. Free. I'm free for the first time in my life. Free from the distressing and dispiriting acts I was expected to commit as a means to someone else's ends, over which I had no say. Free from living someone else's life. Free from investing my happiness in a future ideal. Free from prioritizing doing over being. Free from my internalized capitalism, that my worth as a human being was contingent upon my productivity alone. Free from the lies I'd tell myself and that my mother would tell me, that I couldn't live without my partner, that I was dependent on her in every way, incapable of looking after myself, that I was destined to be a prisoner to that anxious attachment for eternity. Free from being responsible for my partner's feelings, as well as my mother's, and prioritizing them in lieu of my own. Free from sacrificing my own needs, principles, and values out of shame, guilt, misplaced duty, and most acutely, fear. I am free to be me. Authentically me, whatever that is. Autonomous, my own person, a being in his own right. Even though I don't really know who I am, or even if that question is valid, I nonetheless feel like I am closer to embodying my personal truth. I've mentioned my mother a few times for good reason. Another serendipitous event occurred during this tumultuous chapter of my life, wherein I chose to finally stand up to her incessant abuse as well. I made the difficult choice to let go of the guilt of continuing to be her son, the only thread left between us, and I removed that toxic dynamic from my life once and for all. The acts of freeing myself from the bonds of guilt to both my partner and my mother may have coincided, but were not coincidental. True liberation required all shackles to be broken. I've always struggled to define happiness, and I used to be skeptical if such a thing even existed. It's a weird term that has different contexts. But now that I finally feel some semblance of it, I sense intimately what it might be, at least in the context of personal freedom or life satisfaction. Happiness, or perhaps more aptly put, underlying joy, is not in having or doing, but simply in being true to oneself. That's it. Radical honesty with oneself and the will to follow it. But being true to oneself is difficult because it requires one to know themselves, and that path can be murky. I was lost on that path my whole life without realizing it, but for the first time, now that I'm free from the systemic guilt that was obscuring that path, I can finally see where I'm going. I'm am finally able, after my terrifying leap of faith into the not-so-scary abyss of independence, to really try to answer that mysterious calling which has deeply moved me my whole life, that integral part of me which has been invalidated by others, but mostly by my own self-judgment. Whatever this project becomes, it starts now as an open, honest, candid exploration of what calls me from within, that which I am most passionate about, connecting with the nature of being. I seek to steer away from intellectualizing and philosophizing as I've done in the past, and towards my own intimate experience, that which is personal and fundamental to each of us, and from which all experience is known. In my darkest hour, it was my love of being that saved my life. Amid the turbulence of my external circumstances, I returned again and again to my innate inner stillness, to the formless, serene center of beauty, truth, and love. Through presence, I reconnected to the broader perspective of life, beyond my ego's drama, to something greater than myself, to the sublime mystery of existence, and I was reminded of what I was here to embody. For some haunting reason, I feel compelled to share a quote I've held dear since childhood by Pierre Teilhard du Chardin, one of many printed quotes I had on my bedroom wall when I was 13, which, ironically, my mother ripped off in a fit of rage. I feel this quote epitomizes the journey I now embark on as I leave behind the trauma of this particular human backstory, finally unencumbered by guilt, free from my gilded cage, ready to let go of the past, and with an open heart finally attempt to answer that mysterious calling. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience.